Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for coming to our Week 3 debate. This House fears Kim's North Korea more than Putin's Russia. For those of you who this may be your first debate in a while or enjoy the sound of my voice, I'm going to go through the rules again. So, each speaker is given a maximum of 10 minutes to deliver their speech. There is an opportunity for you to get involved by standing up and saying point of information during any speaker's speech, which they can accept or decline. That's where you can ask a question or give your opinion on what they've just said. The other way to get involved is by giving a floor speech. We're going to do 2 rounds of floor speeches, which is where I can ask one of you to speak in proposition, one of you in opposition, and one in abstention of the motion. If you put your hand up, I'll select you, and also if you wouldn't mind saying your name and college so that Tom can write it down, because the best floor speech of term wins a free bike. So you're going to want to give a really good floor speech, because you're going to want a free bike. And also give your real name, not a fake name. However, it's time to get started with the debate. Thank you, everyone, again for showing up. And we begin with the proposition and our first speaker, Rafi. Rafi Marshall is reading Ancient and Modern History at Queen's College, Oxford. He was ranked as the best debater in the world at the World Universities Debating Competition 2017 in The Hague. Rafi, you've set your standards quite high here. You have 10 minutes. The floor is yours.
Last week, for the upteenth time this year, Alexei Navalny is arrested again in Moscow. He goes into prison. He tweets for several hours using a high-power battery to allow him to communicate with his Russian social media followers. And then eventually he's arrested, goes on campaigning, goes on arranging illegal protests, which, whilst they might be cracked down on by the police, will never be fundamentally stopped. If he tried that in North Korea, he would be strapped to the front of a tank and have his brains blown out. His entire family would be chucked into a labor camp for generations to come under a principle of generational guilt. There is a hell of a lot to dislike about Putin's Russia, but it is a fundamentally different state from the totalitarian regime in the north of the Korean Peninsula and poses a threat of an enormously different type. We think that when Russian bombers are sent over UK airspace or around, they potentially carry nuclear missiles or they potentially carry nuclear material. But North Korea routinely fires nuclear missiles or nuclear-capable missiles over its neighbor's airspace over Japan. That is the action of a state which is much more aggressive. Russia is infinitely larger than North Korea, but ultimately, Al-Qaeda is an organization which contains several thousand people at its peak. The ability of an organization or a state to cause harm to the population or to global security has very, very little relationship to its size or its economic capacity. So yes, North Korea may be a total basket case, but it's an extremely dangerous basket case, which may yet blow up Asia-Pacific and the global economy. By contrast, we think Russia has been fundamentally overrated as a threat in an epiphany of scaremongering after the US election. 3 points in this speech. Firstly, why we think Russian aims are limited and unlikely to fundamentally come into clash with their European neighbors or the US, and in essence, they're limited to protecting a small number of Russians outside Russia's borders. Secondly, what we think the character relatively of the Russian regimes are, Russian regime compared to the regime in North Korea, why we think the Russian regime is actually immensely complicated, contains a number of liberal people who are comparatively pro-Western in a way the North Korean regime fundamentally doesn't. Finally, talking about the nature of the threat we think the North Korean regime poses. And then after that, the people after me who actually know things about the subject will offer you a wealth of information to improve your minds. So firstly, in terms of why we think Russian aims are fundamentally limited. Look, Russia's campaign in Ukraine is infamous, but you do have to remember that it is occupying probably about 5% of Ukraine. In essence, 2 cities in eastern Ukraine, in the Donbass, Luhansk, or Donetsk, and Crimea. A small portion of the territory it could have chosen to take had it devoted its entire resources to it. Is that a heinous infliction on the Ukrainian people and a huge breach of international law? Undoubtedly. But it's also the action of a state whose aims are limited towards a small number of peripheral areas in in its immediate vicinity, protecting Russians who live right across its own border. If you look at its invasion of Georgia, similarly, it sets up a beach resort in Abkhazia and then a village in South Ossetia. These are violations of international law, which are very genuine, but whose effect is relatively modest and limited. Or alternatively, you have the Belarusian state, which is offering itself for union with Russia, but it's been consistently refused by Moscow, which is not interested in the commitment of bringing on another very poor region on its periphery. This is not the action of a state which has global intentions or which is fundamentally expansionist and is going to roll into Riga or Tallinn tomorrow. So we think that the risk of Russia seriously expanding has been seriously overrated. Because its actions in its periphery are so limited at present, we see no reason to believe they'll become dramatically larger. Why is it that its actions on its borders are currently so limited? We think there are 3 reasons why it's not going to have a much more ambitious agenda. Firstly, the vast majority of Russians live in Russia. To the extent the Russian regime has an ideology at present, it is Russian nationalism and the protection of Russians within and without Russia and projection of Russian power. That means there are a relatively small number of people who you might make sounds on behalf of, you might militarily intervene on behalf of, living in the Caucasus, in Ukraine, or in other border areas, such as in Estonia, but ultimately the scale of that threat is limited and the scale of that ambition is limited. And even if those people in Estonia are being somewhat mistreated, the scale of their mistreatment is ultimately not enough to justify an intervention by Russia according to its own framework. Secondly, we think that Russia is ultimately a postmodern state which plays with a variety of ideologies to keep a variety of different Russians on board. So it has liberal elements within its ideological arsenal, it has pro-Western elements within its ideological arsenal. The effect of that is that committing overly to an invasion or to nationalism would be a dangerous propaganda move to the Russian regime, which is to say it is useful for it to have a confrontation in Ukraine, which it could use to impress Russian nationalists in Russia. But it's certainly not going to go too far and have an all-out confrontation or war with Europe, because then it would lose those non-trivial portions of the Russian population who feel fundamentally differently and wouldn't support that sort of conflict. The final observation we would make is the Russian army is huge, but it is also primarily composed of conscripts who are having the worst time of their life because they have been unable to afford the bribe to get out of the Russian army. These people are, in essence, not an effective fighting force, but people who are being bullied by alcoholic senior officers. There is a small core of professional soldiers, the vast majority of whom are already deployed in Luhansk or Donetsk or in northern Syria. So the capacity of Russia to launch another major military operation is relatively limited. And if you look at Russia's navy or their military technology, the Russian aircraft carrier, the Kuznetsov, whenever it goes out, the US sends ships to monitor it, not because they think it poses a threat, but because they are, at least in theory, worried that it will sink, because it is aging so much that they think it will spring a leak and go to the bottom of the Mediterranean. So this is not a military power for which we need to have serious concern. Rather, it is a legacy state projecting a few systems in choice places where it has specific interests. And it simply doesn't have the capacity for a more ambitious operation. Go for it.
Know what ethnic Russians they're protecting in the White House?
I think the Russians are trying to enjoy themselves in the United States, which is to say, Putin has fond memories of his youth strolling cheerfully around Berlin and mourns that he no longer has, his fellow Russians no longer have this sort of opportunity. So giving people the chance to do it on Twitter, whilst probably not as fun, is reasonable compensation. So I think this is certainly a threat of sorts to the US, but if the US were to get its political act together, and to regulate its social media properly, the actions of a few hundred Twitter trolls would not constitute a serious political or military threat. I think the idea that the Russians spending a couple of $100,000 on people on Twitter now constitutes a serious political and military threat to the US says much more about the US's political system having become a total basket case than it does about Russia being a real threat. How do we contrast this lack of threat from Russia with North Korea? Look, say what you will about Russia, they recognize all of their neighbors. They might contest border regions, but North Korea does not think South Korea is a legitimate state. It thinks that South Korea is an American-occupied area of its territory where its citizens are being abused. Go for it.
What does the South Korean state think of North Korea?
Likewise, but I think that... So I agree that neither acknowledge the other, but I don't think it follows that the South Korean threat is a security threat to North Korea. If you do want to argue that South Korea is also a security threat, maybe, but they can both be a larger security threat than Russia. In contrast, again, North Korea has an ideology which perceives itself to have global implications. And if you look at Russia's actions versus North Korea's, Russia's are fundamentally less aggressive. So North Korea explicitly sinks a South Korean battleship in 2010 with loss of 54 South Korean lives. Of course, Russia will support proxy forces in Ukraine which do terrible things to Ukrainian servicemen. It doesn't explicitly go out and blow up the Ukrainian naval fleet because it's not so explicitly aggressive towards its neighbors. And even if you believe none of this about the North Korean state, the observation we would make is that Russia has been nuclear armed for the better part of the last century at this stage, and has failed to take nuclear action against any of its neighbors. By contrast, the North Korean regime has only just gained a nuclear capability. So on a balance of risk from people's previous behavior, I think it's reasonable to say that a regime whose behavior cannot yet be determined when it has a nuclear arsenal poses a greater risk than a regime which has a nuclear arsenal for its entire future and has failed to use it. Finally, in terms of why we think North Korea does pose such a fundamental threat, I think the observation I would make is the North Koreans are fundamentally terrified. They disappear regularly into a bunker for prolonged periods of time at the point where they think that they are about to be attacked by the US. And it's watched the collapse of its sister states, both its communist sister states, but also its anti-Western states, Iran, Libya, Iraq, which have been destroyed by American power. And the question Kim Jong-un asked himself is, when are these people going to come for me? This is a man who is wondering where the threat is coming from and is therefore going to be prone to overreacting to any American posturing, such as Trump is doing so at the moment. And when you combine that with China potentially threatening North Korean regime change, and that's something Pyongyang is very concerned about, as we see from the assassination of Kim Jong-nam in Macau, I think that's the potential for a regime which seriously miscalculates and does something deeply irrational. Now, would the US and South Korea ultimately win that war? In the very limited sense of win, probably. But that would be after the loss of 1 million South Korean lives in the firefights surrounding Seoul. That will be after the immense destruction of the global economy as the Asia-Pacific region goes up in flames. There are many legitimate reasons to be worried about the threat Russia poses in its peripheral border regions or to certain other neighboring countries. We should counter those. Ultimately, though, we think that threat is contained and Russia is over-exaggerated as an opponent. By contrast, North Korea is a volatile regime which has the ability to inflict immense suffering on its South Korean neighbor, which it continues not to recognize, and it may do so in the immediate future. Very proud to propose.
Thank you very much, Rafi, for your speech. We now turn to our first speaker for the opposition. We welcome James Hoare, a career diplomat in the Foreign Office. Jim laid the foundations for the establishment of the British Embassy in Pyongyang. Jim, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Yes, there I was, trowel in hand, cement in the other. No, I established the embassy. I didn't lay the foundations. An interesting speech. Some of the older members of the audience might remember a program called the Rowan and Martin Laugh-In. And on the Rowan and Martin Laugh-In, eventually, every episode, a German officer would appear after some statement had been made and say, "Very clever, but stupid." Now, I'm not saying you're stupid. I don't think you are. But No, seriously. I wouldn't dream of saying anybody was stupid. I think you may have actually lost one member of your side if John's body language was anything to go by. That you can't hide it, John. It's no good. I should perhaps say that John and I have had a run-to this morning, one of the many run-tos we've had over the years about how you interpret North Korea. I should also thank you for the invitation tonight. This is something new for me. I wear a dinner jacket once every 20 years or so. So thank God I don't have to wear it for another 20. But also, it is not quite the first, but the last time I actually took part in a debate like this, or any sort of debate for that matter, apart from 1-to-1 or 2-to-2, was in 1958. So, you know, what goes round comes round. Here am I tonight. And the debate was on our headmaster banned a jazz club, and we had a debate whether we should be allowed to have jazz or not. I don't know what, I can't remember what the outcome was, but he was a bit of an autocrat, so he probably didn't. But North Korea, yeah, nasty. And it is. It's not a nice place to live. I wouldn't want to live there permanently as a North Korean. But it is something that you have to be very careful of, how much we know about it. The North Koreans are not sending nuclear-tipped rockets over Japan or anywhere else at the moment. They say they could do. They haven't said they've done so. They may get there one day, but they might not. Remember, all of you, the wise words of the father of the current leader of North Korea, Kim Jong-il. He told a group of visiting South Korean journalists back in 2000 that anybody who said they were an expert on North Korea was a fool. I agree with him entirely. So I don't claim to be an expert on North Korea. I know a little about it. I live there. I've studied it. But North Korea is very difficult to understand. And exaggerated statements about what it can or cannot do, or what it might or might not do, don't help. One day we'll know more. We know much more about North Korea than we used to do, but we don't know very much about how the leadership works and what it thinks and what it does. So there are some caveats. Now, I jotted down, because I'm not very good at remembering these sort of things, a whole lot of figures that you balance. In fact, I think this is the wrong term for this debate tonight. It should really be, is North Korea more dangerous than Mr. Trump's America? There I think you really would have a debate. But North Korea is a small country. It's about the size of the British Isles without the peripheries. It's about the size of Kansas, for those of you who are benighted enough not to live in this beautiful country of ours. So that gives you some ideas of how big it is. It has a population of 24 million. Its southern neighbor, South Korea, where I've also lived, has a population double that. I won't go into figures for GDP and so on, because I didn't write them down, foolishly enough. But the South Korean GDP is enormous. It used not to be. It used to be a basket case, $100 a head a year back in 1960. Well, that's all changed. North Korea is not the poorest country in the world, despite what you read in the press and so on, but it is pretty poor. A very small GDP. Per head, it says about $850. It has a huge army, a decrepit army, full of Second World War equipment, tanks, artillery, and so on. Now, a lot of that will work. The artillery certainly would work, and Seoul is, as you said, very vulnerable. They could hit Seoul just like that. They don't have to give any notification. Drive along the north side of the demilitarized zone, which I've done, and John may have done as well. John Everard here, my former diplomatic colleague, later ambassador in Pyongyang. And you see hillsides with doors. And you say to your guide, why have those hillsides got doors? And they say, you know damn well why those hillsides have got doors. There's artillery behind them, just as there is around the airport, by the way, in Pyongyang. And over at Hamhung, you can see artillery trained on the town. North Korea is very suspicious of its own people, you're right. But this artillery is aimed at Seoul. And all they have to do is to open the doors, you get no notification, they open the doors and they set loose the artillery on Seoul. And Seoul would be the easiest possible target in the world. It is a quarter of the population of the country, nearly 30 million in the greater Seoul area. It is 20 miles or so from the demilitarized zone, from the division line between the two countries. Even if only a quarter of that artillery works, Seoul will be destroyed. So, yeah, there is a threat. But so far it's been contained over the years. Now, the North Koreans have said they have nuclear weapons, they have the means of delivering them. They haven't actually shown that they have a viable nuclear weapon. They've got nuclear devices, they've tested them, and they fired rockets. But they haven't yet shown that they can. I'm not saying they aren't on that trajectory. I'm sure they are. But they're not there yet. Contrast that, my friends, with Putin's Russia. Now, I agree that Putin may have limited aims and purposes in the world. But go to Tallinn, or even go to Bishkek, or go to any of the capitals of former parts of the Soviet Union, and there is considerable concern about Russia's possible long-term intentions towards them. Russia, to those countries, is still seen as a threat. The Soviet Union and Russia have always valued some sort of protective corridor against the West, and Putin is no different from that. Putin threatens and has the potential to threaten, the power to threaten, which the North Koreans do not have. The power
threat is limited and the scale of that ambition is limited. And even if those people in Estonia are being somewhat mistreated, the scale of their mistreatment is ultimately not enough to justify an intervention by Russia according to its own framework. Secondly, we think that Russia is ultimately a postmodern state which plays with a variety of ideologies to keep a variety of different Russians on board. So it has liberal elements within its ideological arsenal, it has pro-Western elements within its ideological arsenal. The effect of that is that committing overly to an invasion or to nationalism would be a dangerous propaganda move to the Russian regime, which is to say it is useful for it to have a confrontation in Ukraine, which could use to impress Russian nationalists in Russia. But it's certainly not going to go too far and have an all-out confrontation or war with Europe, because then it would lose those non-trivial portions of the Russian population who feel fundamentally differently and wouldn't support that sort of conflict. The final observation we would make is the Russian army is huge, but it is also primarily composed of conscripts who are having the worst time of their life because they have been unable to afford the bribe to get out of the Russian army. These people are, in essence, not an effective fighting force, but people who are being bullied by alcoholic senior officers. There is a small core of professional soldiers, the vast majority of whom are already deployed in Luhansk or Donetsk or in northern Syria. So the capacity of Russia to launch another major military operation is relatively limited. And if you look at Russia's navy or their military technology, the Russian aircraft carrier, the Kuznetsov, whenever it goes out, the US sends ships to monitor it, not because they think it poses a threat, but because they are, at least in theory, worried that it will sink, because it is aging so much that they think it will spring a leak and go to the bottom of the Mediterranean. So this is not a military power for which we need to have serious concern. Rather, it is a legacy state projecting a few systems in choice places where it has specific interests. And it simply doesn't have the capacity for a more ambitious operation. Go for it.
Know what ethnic Russians they're protecting in the White House.
I think the Russians are trying to enjoy themselves in the United States, which is to say, Putin has fond memories of his youth strolling cheerfully around Berlin and mourns that he no longer has, his fellow Russians no longer have this sort of opportunity. So giving people the chance to do it on Twitter, whilst probably not as fun, is reasonable compensation. So I think this is certainly a threat of sorts to the US, but if the US were to get its political act together, and to regulate its social media properly, the actions of a few hundred Twitter trolls would not constitute a serious political or military threat. I think the idea that the Russians spending a couple of $100,000 on people on Twitter now constitutes a serious political and military threat to the US says much more about the US's political system having become a total basket case than it does about Russia being a real threat. How do we contrast this lack of threat from Russia with North Korea? Look, say what you will about Russia, they recognize all of their neighbors. They might contest border regions, but North Korea does not think South Korea is a legitimate state. It thinks that South Korea is an American-occupied area of its territory where its citizens are being abused. Go for it.
What does the South Korean state think of North Korea?
Likewise, but I think that So I agree that neither acknowledge the other, but I don't think it follows that the South Korean threat is a security threat to North Korea. If you do want to argue that South Korea is also a security threat, maybe, but they can both be a larger security threat than Russia. In contrast, again, North Korea has an ideology which perceives itself to have global implications. And if you look at Russia's actions versus North Korea's, Russia's are fundamentally less aggressive. So North Korea explicitly sinks a South Korean battleship in 2010 with loss of 54 South Korean lives. Of course, Russia will support proxy forces in Ukraine which do terrible things to Ukrainian servicemen. It doesn't explicitly go out and blow up the Ukrainian naval fleet because it's not so explicitly aggressive towards its neighbors. And even if you believe none of this about the North Korean state, the observation we would make is that Russia has been nuclear armed for the better part of the last century at this stage, and has failed to take nuclear action against any of its neighbors. By contrast, the North Korean regime has only just gained a nuclear capability. So on a balance of risk from people's previous behavior, I think it's reasonable to say that a regime whose behavior cannot yet be determined when it has a nuclear arsenal poses a greater risk than a regime which has a nuclear arsenal for its entire future and has failed to use it. Finally, in terms of why we think North Korea does pose such a fundamental threat, I think the observation I would make is the North Koreans are fundamentally terrified. They disappear regularly into a bunker for prolonged periods of time at the point where they think that they are about to be attacked by the US. And it's watched the collapse of its sister states, both its communist sister states, but also its anti-Western states, Iran, Libya, Iraq, which have been destroyed by American power. And the question Kim Jong-un asked himself is, when are these people going to come for me? This is a man who is wondering where the threat is coming from and is therefore going to be prone to overreacting to any American posturing, such as Trump is doing so at the moment. And when you combine that with China potentially threatening North Korean regime change, and that's something Pyongyang is very concerned about, as we see from the assassination of Kim Jong-nam in Macau, I think that's the potential for a regime which seriously miscalculates and does something deeply irrational. Now, would the US and South Korea ultimately win that war? In the very limited sense of win, probably. But that would be after the loss of 1 million South Korean lives in the firefights surrounding Seoul. That will be after the immense destruction of the global economy as the Asia-Pacific region goes up in flames. There are many legitimate reasons to be worried about the threat Russia poses in its peripheral border regions or to certain other neighboring countries. We should counter those. Ultimately, though, we think that threat is contained and Russia is over-exaggerated as an opponent. By contrast, North Korea is a volatile regime which has the ability to inflict immense suffering on its South Korean neighbor, which it continues not to recognize, and it may do so in the immediate future. Very proud to propose.
Thank you very much, Rafi, for your speech. We now turn to our first speaker for the opposition. We welcome James Hoare, a career diplomat in the Foreign Office. Jim laid the foundations for the establishment of the British Embassy in Pyongyang. Jim, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Yes, there I was, trowel in hand, cement in the other. No, I established the embassy. I didn't lay the foundations. An interesting speech. Some of the older members of the audience might remember a program called The Rowan and Martin Laugh-In. And on the Rowan and Martin Laugh-In, eventually, every episode, a German officer would appear after some statement had been made and say, "Very clever, but stupid." Now, I'm not saying you're stupid. I don't think you are. But No, seriously. I wouldn't dream of saying anybody was stupid. I think you may have actually lost one member of your side if John's body language was anything to go by. That you can't hide it, John. It's no good. I should perhaps say that John and I have had a run-to this morning, one of the many run-tos we've had over the years about how you interpret North Korea. I should also thank you for the invitation tonight. This is something new for me. I wear a dinner jacket once every 20 years or so. So thank God I don't have to swear it for another 20. But also, it is not quite the first, but the last time I actually took part in a debate like this, or any sort of debate for that matter, apart from 1-to-1 or 2-to-2, was in 1958. So, you know, what goes round comes round. Here am I tonight. And the debate was on, our headmaster banned a jazz club, and we had a debate whether we should be allowed to have jazz or not. I don't know what, I can't remember what the outcome was, but he was a bit of an autocrat, so he probably didn't. But North Korea, yeah, nasty. And it is. It's not a nice place to live. I wouldn't want to live there permanently as a North Korean. But it is something that you have to be very careful of, how much we know about it. The North Koreans are not sending nuclear-tipped rockets over Japan or anywhere else at the moment. They say they could do. They haven't said they've done so. They may get there one day, but they might not. Remember, all of you, the wise words of the father of the current leader of North Korea, Kim Jong-il. He told a group of visiting South Korean journalists back in 2000 that anybody who said they were an expert on North Korea was a fool. I agree with him entirely. So I don't claim to be an expert on North Korea. I know a little about it. I live there. I've studied it. But North Korea is very difficult to understand. And exaggerated statements about what it can or cannot do, or what it might or might not do, don't help. One day we'll know more. We know much more about North Korea than we used to do, but we don't know very much about how the leadership works and what it thinks and what it does. So there are some caveats. Now, I jotted down, because I'm not very good at remembering these sort of things, a whole lot of figures that you balance. In fact, I think this is the wrong term for this debate tonight. It should really be, is North Korea more dangerous than Mr. Trump's America? There I think you really would have a debate. But North Korea is a small country. It's about the size of the British Isles without the peripheries. It's about the size of Kansas, for those of you who are benighted enough not to live in this beautiful country of ours. So that gives you some ideas of how big it is. It has a population of 24 million. Its southern neighbor, South Korea, where I've also lived, has a population double that. I won't go into figures for GDP and so on, because I didn't write them down, foolishly enough. But the South Korean GDP is enormous. It used not to be. It used to be a basket case, $100 a head a year back in 1960. Well, that's all changed. North Korea is not the poorest country in the world, despite what you read in the press and so on, but it is pretty poor. A very small GDP. Per head, it says about $850. It has a huge army, a decrepit army, full of Second World War equipment, tanks, artillery, and so on. Now, a lot of that will work. The artillery certainly would work, and Seoul is, as you said, very vulnerable. They could hit Seoul just like that. They don't have to give any notification. Drive along the north side of the demilitarized zone, which I've done, and John may have done as well. John Everard here, my former diplomatic colleague, later ambassador in Pyongyang. And you see hillsides with doors. And you say to your guide, why have those hillsides got doors? And they say, you know damn well why those hillsides have got doors. There's artillery behind them, just as there is around the airport, by the way, in Pyongyang. And over at Hamhung, you can see artillery trained on the town. North Korea is very suspicious of its own people, you're right. But this artillery is aimed at Seoul. And all they have to do is to open the doors, you get no notification, they open the doors and they set loose the artillery on Seoul. And Seoul would be the easiest possible target in the world. It is a quarter of the population of the country, nearly 30 million in the greater Seoul area. It is 20 miles or so from the demilitarized zone, from the division line between the two countries. Even if only a quarter of that artillery works, Seoul will be destroyed. So, yeah, there is a threat. But so far it's been contained over the years. Now, the North Koreans have said they have nuclear weapons, they have the means of delivery them. They haven't actually shown that they have a viable nuclear weapon. They've got nuclear devices, they've tested them, and they fired rockets. But they haven't yet shown that they can. I'm not saying they aren't on that trajectory. I'm sure they are. But they're not there yet. Contrast that, my friends, with Putin's Russia. Now, I agree that Putin may have limited aims and purposes in the world. But go to Tallinn, or even go to Bishkek, or go to any of the other the capitals of former parts of the Soviet Union, and there is considerable concern about Russia's possible long-term intentions towards them. Russia, to those countries, is still seen as a threat. The Soviet Union and Russia have always valued some sort of protective corridor against the West, and Putin is no different from that. Putin threatens and has the potential to threaten, the power to threaten, which the North Koreans do not have, the power to threaten whole parts of Europe. Some of you, as well as remembering the Rowan and Martin Laughlin, and I think there were two people who clearly responded to that, but some of you will remember, or your parents will remember for most of you, or maybe your grandparents even, will remember the Cuban Missile Crisis. I was your age, the young people's age. I was 19. And we really thought in Western Europe, in the autumn of 1962, that we were going to be annihilated, that we were in danger of a nuclear war. Now, North Korea could do nothing like that to Western Europe. I know, bloody hell. I know some ministers have said, including the Prime Minister, North Korea is a threat. They can't develop nuclear weapons, but they do show why we should have nuclear weapons. I mean, come on. If we need them, they would say they need them against the enormous threat that the United States poses. So I'm sorry, the rhetoric is very anti-North Korean. The knowledge about North Korea is very limited. The press builds these things up. The number of journalists I've had on the phone saying, are we going to have a nuclear war? And I say, I don't think so. And they say, oh, no, but please say, we want you to say there's going to be a nuclear war. And I hope that tonight, in my rambling way, I've persuaded you that I would not trust North Korea, but I wouldn't trust Mr. Putin either. Thank you.
Jim, thank you very much for your speech. Before, Barbara, before you start speaking, we're doing a round of floor speeches from the audience, if that's okay. Sorry. But thank you. It'll be next. If you'd like to speak in proposition of the motion, please put your hand up. Anybody? Yes. Please say your name and college for Tom.
Thank you. Kirill Reshtov, Fitzwilliam College. So I think a lot has been made of the magnitude of the threat, respectively, from North Korea and from Russia. But to paraphrase for the lawyers in the room, the learned hand, I think a threat needs two elements, and that's the expected magnitude of damage, but also the expected risk of that damage. And I would say that the expected risk from Russia is much smaller. And my main argument for that would be the role that collective memory of the Second World War plays in Russian society. Now, I spent my early childhood growing up in St. Petersburg, and I remember going to the Museum of the Blockade of Leningrad, more shocking than the way that Slavs, as Untermensch, were put into makeshift cages and starved, or the cannibalism during the blockade of Leningrad. The most shocking thing I found was how people would take cogs from factories and take off the little leather and make soup, because that's what they needed to do to survive. Now, there were almost 28 million casualties from Russia, and everybody has a story like that in Russia. So how does that translate into policy nowadays? Well, more popular than any anti-Putin protest or pro-Putin protest or Nemtsov remembrance rally is what we call in Russian Besmertny Polk, the immortal regiment. This is in essence a march which is in remembrance of the war. And I, sort of, as a good Cambridge student, I went on their website to research the aim of this. And, you know, it has over 700,000 people marching in Moscow compared to tens of thousands for any political party. Over a tenth of the population in places like Khabarovsk. And I went on their front page, and this is really the aim. This is how it concludes. I translate from the Russian. We must remember, a war begins when a generation grows up which has forgotten the previous war. Now, I'd like to say to the opposition, and actually to the first proposition speaker as well, who seems so keen to put this anti-Russian rhetoric before the House today, the Russians haven't forgotten, have you?
If you'd like to reply, Jim, yeah.
Reply, but as a comment. Do you know what happened to North Korea during the Korean War? Now, North Korea may have started the war, but it was doing exactly what South Korea said it wanted to do. It wanted to reunify the country. It didn't happen. By the summer of 1951, the war was over, right? The North Koreans had been driven right back, and then the Chinese had intervened. North Korea was bombed by the US Air Force for the following 2 years without any protection, except in a small area up on the Chinese frontier, Mig Alley. North Korea was bombed into the Stone Age. Even before that bombing started, the head of the US Air Force told Congress there was not a remaining military target in North Korea. There wasn't one. So what did they do? They bombed the temples, they bombed the churches, and eventually they bombed the dams on the Yalu River. And they flooded the whole of the northern part of Korea. And they drowned thousands of people, and others starved because of the lack of things. So memories of war are strong in many countries, but I would think that they are just as strong in North Korea, and they look to the United States as the cause of that, as they are in Russia. So be emotional about Russia. I understand the Russian emotion. I've been there and seen displays on Victory Day and so on. But the North Koreans suffered just as much in terms of total war as the Russians. And that influences them.
I think we'll... Thank you. Would anybody like to speak in opposition of the motion? Yes.
My name is Christina Kim. I'm from South Korea. I'm a student at Christ College. And I thought that you guys might be interested in what the South Koreans perceive this. And I might not represent my own country fellows about this, but the way we feel about the tension is not as strong as you feel in overseas, I would say generally. Like I will get calls from my relatives from America, you know, asking like how am I doing, like how's the family doing, but like when you live in South Korea, you don't feel that kind of threat, like it's like a everyday. I think it's due to the history that because this thing has been going on for many years, but the way I see is sometimes that the international relations, that the forces, the diplomats, we are making North Korea becoming more fearful than they actually are, I think. And for the recent years, Kim Jong-un has been becoming very aggressive, but we should also think that a part of it is also coming from the United States, the over international relations. So I think it really depends on how we approach the regime that will make the regime turn, whether it be fearful or a threat to the whole global society.
Thank you. Finally, anybody in abstention who'd like to speak at the top? Yeah. Is there a microphone upstairs? We can't throw one. Okay, shout. Thank you very much, Theo. We'll now return to the main debate, and hopefully some of those points can be addressed. We go to the proposition, and now Barbara. Barbara Demick is an American journalist, formerly the Beijing bureau chief of the LA Times. Her second book, Nothing to Envy, Ordinary Lives in North Korea, is due to be transformed into an animated film, which is very exciting. Barbara, you have 10 minutes, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. I was thinking about the same thing about the house. My house is New York City at the moment, and we maybe have a different perspective because Americans seem to be more in the crossfire, probably because of our own president, but I won't go into that. I'll talk about North Korea. I've been quite a few times, and I will open with a story that will make you think that I'm arguing for the other side. But I remember running into a large group of North Korean military in Pyongyang, it was almost 10 years ago, when they were mourning at the statue of Kim Il-sung. It's the ritual in Pyongyang that you go and you bring flowers to the foot of Kim Il-sung, the father. And I remember seeing these North Korean soldiers going and bowing. And what was shocking to me watching them was when they bowed and it hitched up their trousers, none of them had socks. This was late October. It was already very cold. It was during the Pyongyang Film Festival, I'm remembering. No socks. And that was my image of the North Korean military. Yes, per capita, it's one of the largest militaries in the world. I think 1.1 million men under arms. But they are poor, they are hungry, and I believe that's what makes them dangerous. There's a saying that you hear a lot in China, and it's that the barefoot man doesn't fear the man who has shoes. The Chinese love this kind of thing. I'm sure it sounds better in Chinese. But you know what it means is that these guys don't have that much to lose. And so a lot of our conventional assumptions about détente that were sort of, put into political science and, were our lore during the Cold War, really don't apply to North Korea. This is a very poor country that's really on the edge. And North Koreans, really always believe the end is near. I've seen recent reportage out of North Korea. One of my friends, Evan Osnos, did a piece for the New Yorker. Nick Kristof of the New York Times was there. I'm sorry, I should be citing the British press, but this is what I read. And the message the North Koreans are saying, and it's a message, there's always talking points, is that we don't care if we all die because we're so desperate. If you attack us, we're going to fight to the end. And, maybe a few thousand people will survive, and that's enough. Okay, this is a message. They don't necessarily believe that, but that's what they're saying. And this is, again, what makes them very dangerous. And again, you'll think I'm arguing for the other side. I don't see North Korea starting a war. I don't see North Korea attacking South Korea. You'll hear some of the right-wing right-wing speakers in the US say that North Korea still wants to control the whole Korean peninsula, that the point of their nuclear weapons is to take it over. I don't believe that. I mean, South Korea is twice its size in population. I don't remember the number, how many times larger in GNP. North Korea cannot swallow South Korea, and I think that's why South Koreans are not really afraid. But you have, the unpredictable element here, which is Donald Trump. Now, I'm not going to speak much about Trump because as an American journalist, I'm not supposed to criticize Trump in public. There's maybe others here, but we're supposed to be very objective. But obviously the Trump administration has made noises about a bloody nose, about a big button, this and that. Really plays into the hands of the North Koreans because North Korea has been telling its people for decades, the reason you're poor, the reason you're hungry is because of the hostility of the US. The US is to blame for the lack of food, the lack of electricity. They always blame the US. They cannot live without hostility towards the US. So the anti-Americanism is the force that gives them meaning. They need that. So the US administration has played directly into the hands of the North Korean propagandists. But, that said, they've gotten the North Koreans prepared. They've made just amazing progress with their missiles and nuclear weapons. Nobody thought they would be where they are now, with functional nuclear weapons, ICBMs. I mean, they can certainly reach the United States. Can they get a nuclear warhead in through the atmosphere? Maybe not yet, but they will be able to soon. They are much more capable than we ever thought possible, and they're much more desperate. And part of the issue here is that you can't really have a limited war with North Korea. And I've seen some of the simulations of what would happen if a war starts in North Korea. One of the simulations is the US decides to do a limited tactical strike, maybe try to take out, well, they don't really know where the nuclear program is now, but maybe they try to take out a submarine base, just something to send a message. The North Koreans have to retaliate. They can't just take it because North Korea's whole existence is dependent on being threatening. So they retaliate in some way, maybe limited, a small strike across the DMZ. Other speakers have spoken about they have 11,000 artillery pieces at the DMZ, maybe a small strike at a US base near the DMZ, something near Guam, a limited retaliation. But then the US has to retaliate. And at this point, you really have a danger of spinning out of control because the North Koreans know that they can't win a conventional war. Their equipment is old, it's World War II era, their soldiers are hungry, they have no socks. I'm sorry, but socks and shoes are very important to a military. So they have to go nuclear very fast, because if it's a use it or lose it. And that's where it really gets dangerous. And the one thing they've said that I believe is that if we go down, we're going to take you all down with us. And there's something we talk about, the last lash of the dragon's tail. Something really terrible could happen, and it defies any assumptions we have about détente, and nobody would do anything that stupid. And again, I don't think Kim Jong-un is crazy. I don't think the North Koreans want to attack, but they are a huge threat. And I'll just end on then what? Suppose we manage to take out Kim Jong-un's regime. In the best of all possible worlds, we attack, they counterattack, we attack, we take them out. After a couple of days, there's not massive casualties in South Korea. The North Korean regime falls. Then what? you have this, this huge vacuum of power in North Korea, and you have China on the other side. Now, I think the Chinese have said if North Korea starts something, they're not going to get involved. And to be honest, I think even if the US starts it, I think they're not going to jump in. But if North Korea disappears, suddenly the regime collapses, chaos, the Chinese are not going to stand still. And then I think you could have a situation, a little like Syria, but with bigger guns and bigger players, where you have the US and China competing for control of North Korea, and that might be where World War III starts, not in the first phase. So, yeah, very dangerous.
Thank you very much. The mic should be on now, I think.
Is it on?
Yeah.
Is it on? Okay, great.
We now turn to our second speaker on the opposition. Tonight is Louise Mensch, British journalist and former Conservative MP. She is now an outspoken commentator on President Putin and President Trump's alleged links. Louise, you have 10 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. President. And it's wonderful to be back in Cambridge in the middle of enemy territory. And I'm glad to see that you're all here today. So I'm sort of surrounded by towers with just one ally over there sitting, and he's on the opposite benches. But I am incredibly disappointed that the honourable gentleman, the ex-president from Girton, Christopher Steele, is not here tonight, because I had very much hoped that he would turn up and give us the benefit of his expertise. What a hero, a one-man special relationship, completely redefining the way that the Americans see the British. And on the other hand, there was a rumor at one point that General Misha Flynn, which I believe is the Russian word for Mike, as he described himself when signing little love notes to his paramour in Cambridge, would have been here on the other side. So I'm terribly sorry that you're stuck with the dregs of us here. But I feel a little overawed speaking in this debate with which. Yeah, you're on my side. That seems a little harsh.
But we're not dregs. We are your supporters.
Speak to yourself. Speak for yourself. Quite so. Quite so. I've now completely lost my place. Nevertheless, I feel overawed by the very much not dregs on both sides of the House, because this debate has been described in my hearing as the North Korea debate. And I feel rather like the student in my daughter's middle school who signed her middle school graduation yearbook, "I'm not a vegetarian because I love animals, I'm a vegetarian because I hate plants." So while this debate does appear to be mostly about whether or not how bad really is North Korea, I'm the only person here that's going to speak a little bit about Russia. And I almost hesitate to do so, as my knowledge of North Korea is zero and my knowledge of Russia only marginally much more. But what I can speak about from the sharp end of the wedge is the threat that Mr. Putin and his armies of trolls represent. Let me say how much I enjoyed the honourable gentleman's summary of why Russia at the moment under Putin is rubbish at war, because yes, it certainly is rubbish at war. I have had an awful lot of fun trolling various Russian embassies with pictures of the handheld Garmin GPS that they tie to their planes with literally an elastic band. Pictures taken by the US Air Force, because that is all that they can afford. When they send their little ships to go trolling through the British Channel, we sent the Royal Navy, in a masterly piece of response, literally sent a tug that is there for broken down wrecks and junk, so that in case they broke down, we'd have something to tow the wreckage away. I agree that Russia therefore does not represent any kind of a serious military threat. And it made me laugh as I looked at the social media operations during 2016, when the media bot said, "Are you prepared to go to World War III for her? Would you fight for her? Would you die for her?" As if Vladimir Putin, even as mad as he is, would dare to declare war on the United States, would dare to declare war on bloody Denmark. Let's let's not go crazy, boys. You're not going to declare a war on anybody anytime soon. The danger that Mr. Putin represents is far greater than physical war. And I am slightly surprised in this eminent house to hear all the debates centering on bombs, nuclear bombs, wars, ships, and so forth. I won't say that that's not a threat. Certainly, I'm sure in South Korea it is a very real threat. We are weighing up President Putin and Kim Jong-un, who is the madder out of these two mad hatters, and therefore which of them represents the further danger. But let me scotch a myth. It is a myth, it is nonsense, propagated by bad actors, that Russia spent $100,000 in the last election. I had to laugh. The Internet Research Agency, ladies and gentlemen, isn't a thing. It was invented by the FSB. It was published by Julian Assange in a Russian paper from Russia. It is an FSB psyop. The amount of Russian bots and trolls that are created are far more than one little well-known front-faced tiny agency and the 2 shillings and sixpence that somebody spent on actual Russian ads from Facebook and stories that came out of RT. That's not how it works. They have vast swathes and tracts of servers in Ukraine, across Eastern Europe, buried in the middle of Moscow, that are absolutely enormous and vast and which are being tracked by the NSA in real time. And I was and I still am a supporter of Brexit. Mr. Putin is a supporter of Brexit, but then again, we both like dogs, and I don't see why I should hate dogs just because he likes them. I noticed in my support of Brexit that there were these apparently British people who rather strangely also like Trump and Marine Le Pen and Viktor Orban and President Putin and other things that your average jolly Tommy British guy really doesn't give a monkey's about, especially Trump. And I remember saying to one of these guys, even though your screen name is literally Alfred Albion, I have my suspicions. You appear to be posting all the time at Moscow time. You have a strange fascination with Donald Trump. I don't know one person in England that thinks anything of Donald Trump. And who the hell is Viktor Orban? Never heard of him. And why do you keep banging on about Nigel Farage? I mean, give over. That guy's run 7 times for MP and never been elected to anything. Eventually, he coughs up that he is indeed a Russian, but just loves Britain, hence the Alfred Albion thing and so forth. And I began to notice that these bots weren't just British about Brexit, nor were they just for Trump. They exist, and I cannot fault Putin's ambition, in every language that I could see. There were Russian bots in Japanese, ladies and gentlemen. There were Russian bots in Finnish. There were Russian bots in Arabic. Putin was spreading the Gerasimov doctrine of hybrid warfare across the globe. And while we look at Kim Jong-un and say, what a madman, he is crazy, and indeed he is, who assassinates their own brother with deadly gas in an airport, nevertheless, Putin's madness is, I think, underestimated and underreported on. My sources, with links to the intelligence community, tell me that the phones are blowing up in the Kremlin with furious oligarchs who have realized only too late, of which Dmitry Firtash, who founded an institute at Cambridge, which became the foundation of the spy Alex Kogan, who stole Facebook data of millions of Americans and people around the world for his psychographic testing, and then went away and founded a company called GSR that became SCL, the propaganda arm of Cambridge Analytica. Ladies and gentlemen, and I don't just say this because I'm from the other place, 1 Russian spying at Cambridge may be regarded as unfortunate. 2 is beginning to look like carelessness. Can you please get yourselves together? I know now you half of MI6 are being staffed by this honourable university, but could you please look around and maybe ask the FSB to go somewhere else for a change, if only for variety? And really, if they had more people from Oxford, I like to think that MI6 wouldn't have got us in this mess. But if Christopher Steele is watching, I apologise for that. Should have recruited me. I'd have been bloody great at it. As I was saying, the war that Putin has waged on the West, and we saw it recently in Catalonia, where Glenn Greenwald and Julian Assange, erstwhile lefties, are suddenly pushing Catalan independence. I was insulted during Scottish independence. I call them bots for Brexit and Ivans for IndieRef by somebody who noted the amount of money I gave to Ruth Davison, the Conservative MSP, and said, oh, she's more loco than local. Unfortunately, he'd forgotten to switch off his GPS tracking, which showed that he was posting from Moscow. The screen name was Yes, Thatcher Dead, which they thought would appeal to Scottish Indies. It was replied to by another guy, geolocated in St. Petersburg, who rejoiced in the name of Pete-seeking missile. I got to give the Russian trolls points for style, I'll be honest with you. I like their sense of humour. They're ballsy and they're gutsy. But what on earth possessed Vladimir Putin? Honestly, at this point, I think the world's worst spy, a guy who would recruit Carter Page as an asset, a guy that would recruit the hapless Mike Flynn as an asset, a guy who, ladies and gentlemen, would recruit Donald Trump as an asset. All of these people are going to go down. And when they go down, let me tell Russia, because I know they do look at me. They were kind enough to give me several awards. Russia Today, she said modestly, Russia Today voted their top 10 Russophobes in the world, and literally the list was like this. 1, Senator John McCain. 2, NATO. 3, Louise Mensch. I'm not joking. Just the other day, the Russian embassy in South Africa, and by just the other day, I mean Monday of this week, the Russian embassy in South Africa verified account gave me its prestigious fake news award because I've misquoted. Thank you. I'm not kidding when I say thank you. Please boost my credibility some more. Tell me what a galactic threat I am because I'm a woman that speaks up. When I said on Twitter, ladies of the FSB, and I'm sure there are several of you students in here tonight who qualify, by the way, ladies of the FSB, have you noticed that Putin only ever makes oligarchs men? What does he give? Is there a single woman who has her own private jet? And do you know what happened? The verified Russian Foreign Ministry, the Foreign Ministry of Russia, in its English account, started pointing me to the head of the central bank. I said, first of all, they're debating me. I said, where's her jet? Where's her private island? Where's her giant, massive yacht in the British West Indies? Absolutely nowhere. Ladies, you're being used. Defect to the CIA. You can become somebody here. You can be somebody here. Have you seen the Bond films? You can become M. We're all about equality over here. Do you want to lie down for your country? Or do you want to stand up and fight for it? Because that's what the Russians say. Our men stand up for our country. We ask our women to lay down for it. You cannot survive in this day and age with that attitude. President Putin bit off far more than he could chew. And the honourable gentleman, the ex-president from Girton, in his magnificent dossier of raw intelligence, said it best when he said that half of the people in the Kremlin were saying, stop, 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 taking the joke too far, taking the joke too far. It's too late now, boys. It's too late. There's going to be a total Russian embargo. There's going to be red warrants on every oligarch that was involved in this. Oleg Deripaska, you're next. All the rest of them, every single one of them that had anything to do with this is going to be under a red warrant for the rest of their lives. And you know what that means? It means they're going to have to stay in Russia. Putin vor, they chanted in the streets. This isn't about the Russian people being bad, and it isn't about the North Koreans being bad. It's about those noble peoples and what they deserve, the same freedom and liberty and the same choice that we have. And I oppose this motion, not because I think North Korea is horrible, and not because I think Russia is horrible. Neither are a threat. The madmen at the top of the regimes are a threat, and they have to be removed so that those people, our friends and allies, can thrive and this world can be peaceful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Louise, for your speech, and I'm pleased the microphone is working. We now turn to our third speaker from the proposition, and this is Tim Riley. Tim is a former business consultant to Russian oil and gas companies, and he's currently a mature postgraduate student at Cambridge researching Sino-Russian relations in the Arctic and Northeast Asia. Tim, you have 10 minutes. The floor is yours.
Starting now. Right. In line with some of the themes that have come through this evening in terms of opening speeches, I want to see if you remember an actor called Clint Eastwood. Those a little bit older will remember him in a series of films in the 1970s, Dirty Harry, The Enforcer, these sort of films where he plays a San Francisco homicide policeman. And he's pretty aggressive, and he's pretty unreformed, and certainly not politically correct. And he's standing in the DA's office in San Francisco with the chief of police. And they've called him in because although he's the way he is, he's a good cop, and he knows how to do things. And they've got a murder on the loose. So the DA is telling him about this, and Dirty Harry, as he's known in the film, Inspector Callahan, Clint, is looking at his nails. He's not really too bothered and not engaged. And the DA gets quite frustrated and says, listen, Callahan, I don't want any of your action around here. I know how you operate. This isn't going to work. And that guy you killed last month downtown, that's got to stop. And by the way, why did you have to shoot him? And Dirty Harry looks up and he goes, you know what, sir? When I see a full-grown man running naked down the street chasing a woman with a gun in one hand and a hard-on in the other, I figure he ain't out collecting for the Red Cross. The DA turns to the chief of police and says he's got a point. My point is, as has been mentioned, and I'm trying to bring some threads together, is that we have to define who we are tonight and what really is the nature of this question. Firstly, I'd like to imagine that you are actually not who you are right now, but you are in the UN Assembly, and you represent every country on Earth. And you are looking quite seriously now at choice. Do we put our efforts into Russia or into North Korea? It may be that we can't do both. Secondly, when we say in the title, who we are most afraid of, I would suggest that we're not looking at who. What we're really saying, and we need to define, is threat. Who do we feel threatened most by? Threat is three things: intent to harm, then the capability to harm, and finally the outcome, the risk, what it's going to cost me as the attacker and you having been attacked. Those are the three components of threat, and that's how we need to look at this in terms of North Korea and Russia. So if we look at intent first, all right, what is the intention of North Korea? We would suggest it's survivability, but that is not a policy. That's just a statement of what they would like to do. What is Russia's intention? We can come back to that, but it's actually quite clear in terms of what Putin wants. Does Russia have the capability? It most certainly does. It has everything from conventional to cyber, to fake news, to nuclear, and to other means as well, overt, covert, propaganda, media, and all the rest of it. At the moment, we suspect that North Korea only has a nuclear capability. And even then, at the moment, to be fair, he hasn't got that. The intelligence services say he's well on the way. He has the means of delivery. He's got the rocket, but he hasn't got the warhead yet. But that's very important about understanding intent and capability. And when you have that, and you are threatened by intent and the guy's capable, so the guy's running naked, so you know damn well what his intention is to that woman, and he's got a gun, he's capable of it, what's the outcome? Well, the outcome, history will tell us with Russia, and when it was in the guise of the former Soviet Union, is it does not use its nuclear weapons. As the Russians like to remind the Americans often, the only country on earth that has used a nuclear weapon twice is the United States of America. Russia never did, neither did the Soviet Union. So the idea of outcome is very important in this, in the link. I'd like to explain a little bit about the correlation between intention and capability, because it's very critical to how we will later develop this in terms of Putin's view, and of course the alternatives left open to Kim, who is not less capable and his intentions are less clear. If Russia has a rocket in the Soviet times, and the Warsaw Pact and NATO, we had to respond with a rocket. But the real question, and the doubt was, if they've got this rocket, do they intend to use it? That was the million-dollar question. Being in democracies, the first responsibility, as an MP, you'll remember this correctly, is that it's to defend the people. So we had no alternative, especially with the sort of Christian Judaic background in the West about the sanctity of life. We had to assume if he had that weapon that he would intend to use it. So we had to plan. The planners that actually did do this for us on our behalf, and the military and the intelligence security services, had to assume that. So we spent money to equal it. Okay? What I'm getting at is that Putin, a product of that system, and people my age who lived through that system, and I was a soldier during that period, He knows to the nth degree about intentions and capabilities. And he has a raft of capabilities he brings out. Cyber, have some hype, have some propaganda, have some hybrid warfare, have some Syrian warfare, have some propaganda, have some rhetoric. And he escalates this in a measured way. This is the key. In a measured way, he escalates his capability and signals his intent. And he has a raft of things to do it. And no one on earth knows better than Putin Article 51. He knows exactly to the nth degree how far he can push Article 5 in Estonia. In the last few weeks, we've heard of American aircraft vying with Russian aircraft over Syria in international airspace. Over Britain last week, an RAF fighter went up to escort a Russian bomber from not our airspace, but international airspace, but close to it. And over the Black Sea, I think 2 days ago, a US jet met Russian Tupolev or something over the Black Sea, and international one did the same. This is rhetoric. This is playing the game of intent and capability, keeping people off balance. Okay. With Kim, I can't see that. He has one capability, nuclear, and as mentioned, actually, by the opposition, what else can he do? If he's threatened, the personality he has, the position in, he hits that button or nothing. Putin can come up at you with various instruments of capability and types of capability. So let's look. We've looked at intention there, capability, and outcome, seen that the real thing is threat and how to analytically look at this. Now let's look at personality, because the heading is Kim's North Korea, Putin's Russia. Personalize it. There are three things you want to understand about Putin, whether you like him or not. He's consistent and he's predictable. Okay? He says what he does and he does what he says. And therefore he's predictable and he's consistent in his predictability. For us, therefore, as the United Nations I'm talking to you now, this present threat we've got, he is a negotiator's dream. Because he says what he does, he's predictable and he's consistent, we can understand him. We understand his mind. We know that he understands capability, intent, and the game he's playing. We know that he knows full well he enters Estonia, Poland, or plays around in any way, like shape or form like that, that we will react. He knows this. So we have a man, therefore, that is stable, mentally stable. He may be aggressive, he may be nasty, he may be psychopathic in tendencies, but he's stable and rational, and he's predictable, and he's consistent. So we know what he wants. Kim, on the other hand, I don't really need to go through this, you're way ahead of me, but you can see what I'm going to be saying. He ain't stable, he's pretty unpredictable, he's inconsistent, and therefore he's dangerous, because we can't predict, we can't negotiate with him. On the behavioral side, therefore, let's move now to what... Sure.
I think that you don't really know very much about Kim. Well, none of us really know very much about Kim. But I don't accept this idea that he is unreadable, that he's unstable. I think that you may not like his policies, and I think some of them are very unfortunate, but I think he is far more rational and far more understands the world that he's living in, which is not the peaceful world of Russia, but it is the dangerous world, as he sees it, of East Asia, where he is threatened by the United States, and the United States used to have nuclear weapons on the peninsula. It still has rockets aimed at North Korea by the United States' own admission. And that is what he's coping with. He also is worried that he might face threats, so he deals with those threats. He's not the only person to have killed parts of his family. He's unusual in doing it quite so openly, but his father and his grandfather did the same sort of game as well. So I don't think I accept your premise at all, that this is a totally irrational person. You may not understand his rationality, but there is a rationality there.
Okay. Thank you for the interjection. Let's be then clear. Who is more stable or less stable, Putin or Kim? It's relativity that's important here. A man can be evil, but it really matters, is he more evil than the other guy that's holding a gun? Which one is the more dangerous of the two? Sorry, where was I? So I was into intentions and the behavior. So the points I would really like to say is that the final points really in summation of this is, Let's talk also about isolation, geographical isolation. Russia is a superpower. Here's the key point, ladies and gentlemen. It is no longer a superpower, but it still thinks like a superpower. It is international. It is experienced. It has networks all over the world. It understands Bretton Woods institutions. It joins some of them. It's in security institutions. It's part of the WTO. It understands Shanghai Cooperation Organization, for example. So Russia understands the framework. There is a framework there through which we can talk. To sum up in some ways, let's give an example of what I'm saying about trying to deal with somebody who's rational but dangerous. Putin said 4 things about Syria. I will go in, I will destroy ISIS, I will not replace Assad. I always get this wrong. I will not replace Assad because I consider that a political problem, not a military one. And then I will go. Anybody got any problems with me saying that he did all 4 of those? Rightly or wrong. He went in. He destroyed ISIS. He didn't get rid of Assad. Well, he destroyed ISIS as well as the coalition destroyed AQ. Or we destroyed the IRA, which is now back. And what I'm saying is he solved a particular problem ruthlessly. So from that point of view, he is quite rational in that sense. So my summation is he may be dangerous, but think clearly about personality, intentions and capabilities. Worldwide experience on the stage, knowing fully what capability, how far you can push it and what your intentions are. And bear in mind that rocket North Korea did send into the Sea of Japan, landed in the Sea of Japan, which on the leeward side is about 60% of that territory is Russian, and about 30% was Korea North and South. So the Russians actually had a weapon landing on their coastline, but they didn't react with a nuclear weapon. The very final point, the United States, right now, quite quietly, and you'll see this in the next few months, is actually including Russia in negotiations against Korea. Do you think the United States, with all its intelligence capabilities, in spite of what happened over the presidential elections, would actually go to Putin if they thought there was such a threat to mankind and ask them to help contain the PDRK? Impossible, ladies and gentlemen. So North Korea, as you say, I'm not an expert, but if I had to take a chance now in this United Nations forum and press the button for Russia or Korea, I know which one I would do. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tim. We now move over to the opposition and welcome Adam Cathcart, who is a North Korea analyst and lecturer in contemporary Chinese history and Sino-Korean relations, teaching at the University of Leeds. Adam.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to argue against the proposition largely because I want to come back to so many of the points that our wonderful first speaker made, because I think that North Korea is certainly a threat. It's certainly a challenge. It's a continuous challenge that has adapted and changed. We're having to also adapt simultaneously to an American president who speaks off the cuff, and I'm saying that very politely, very regularly, and channels his innermost demons to the rest of us on a daily basis. And that has helped to kind of accentuate or amplify North Korea's own adaptations, namely its nuclear program. But largely, I think it is a knowable threat. It is a largely continuous process and a sense of continuity that I think the North Koreans bring to us in their strategic outlook. And by us, and I want to speak directly to the point, very good point made by the gentleman in the balcony. By us, I'm going to talk about basically the United Kingdom, the UK, because I think trying to bring the Americans into this special relationship, they've got their own problems with the Russians and with the North Koreans, and I think in some sense there are many shared interests in the special relationship, but I want to talk about the UK, because I think there's some specific advantages that are had actually by kind of pointing to a British point of view towards North Korea, which are somewhat distinct from those in our friends in North America. Expansionism, territory, blitzkriegs, little green men, hybrid warfare. My blood pressure is already higher thinking about these things. So much to learn, so much to discuss. To what extent is North Korea a hybrid warfare threat? To what extent is North Korea interested in expansionism? We have debates about this all the time in North Korean studies and in Korean studies and in people who look at the geopolitics of Northeast Asia. Russia has made certain moves in the last 5 years, certainly, that I think alarm all of us who are trying to pay attention. North Korea's moves on its periphery, in other words, on its territory, which is very closely abutted, obviously, by Seoul, right? And the opposite is true. That South Korean army is very formidable. Look at the jets they have. Look at the drones they're able to marshal. Look at the high-tech capability that they have in South Korea. Look at the weaponry. And it's not just that they're buying it from the Americans, they're buying it from us. They are able to really put the hurt on the North Koreans. And the North Koreans have felt it in the past. Before South Korea was even a technological power, they occupied North Korea for 6 weeks, 8 weeks. They massacred North Koreans. The North Koreans felt it. It's not just B-29 bombs and the bombs coming down from the sky. They understand very much, the government does, if they're looking at their archives and they think about their own history, what it means to be occupied and dominated by South Korea. So the expansionism, that's not to say that South Korea is per se an expansionist force, but North Korea has made small and marginal moves on its periphery, the Northern Limit Line. If you're ever interviewed by the BBC about North Korea, if you receive a phone call that says, we must speak to you about what North Korea's response will be to the latest Trump tweet, as I have been, and I'm sure Jim and others have been, Ambassador Everard, what do you say? You say, well, I think the North Koreans might make a quick move, a limited strike on the Northern Limit Line, the boundary which goes beyond the DMZ, which has never really been agreed to. So there's a little bit of wiggle room. There are small South Korean islands out there. They might do an artillery strike. But that is the extent to which we have seen in the last 10 years that they have done. They have killed people outside of their own territory, blood relatives of the current leader, in an international airport in Malaysia, provocative. It's resulted in them being put back on the state sponsors of terrorism list, as well as possibly illegal things done by an American tourist, a university student in Pyongyang, who, as was pointed out at the recent State of the Union. But that does not, ipso facto, make North Korea an expansionist power in the way that you could argue Russia has been. It certainly moved to reclaim its territory. North Korea has talked about reclaiming territory, made little pinprick strikes along the periphery. And they certainly have not shot down jets full of civilians, although that's been done in the 1980s, right, on their edges, or blown them up, rather. Ideology. Ideas. North Korea has a certain ideology. We often think about it as expansionist again, right? Justification for taking over South Korea, for making moves. We hear about the Byungjin Line, those of you who are moving towards specialization in Korean studies. The Byungjin Line, parallelism. North Korea wants to develop the economy and develop nuclear weapons. And in their minds, that means the nukes protect the economy. Never mind that the nukes result in sanctions. That means petrol is extremely expensive. That means we can't export our coal. That means in some ways we're being strangled economically. But our domestic propaganda means we've got nukes in order to protect everyone else. The rest of us read the Byungjin Line as, my God, nuclear force, a nuclear strike force, 30 to 60 nuclear weapons that can hit, as Barbara Demick mentioned, New York City, or Los Angeles, or Seattle. Of course, they haven't proved they can re-enter the atmosphere. They certainly can't prove that they can hit exactly what they want to hit. And in fact, a colleague of mine who's argued, if you want to be safe, the safest place to be is where the North Koreans are aiming, because they'll probably hit somewhere 60 to 80 miles on either side. So you'd rather be in Everett, Washington than in Seattle, Washington, if you want to be hit by a North Korean missile, etc., right? Now, that's not to disclaim that Guam, Hawaii, these kind of places, right? Okinawa, American bases, as well as in South Korea. These are real threats. It's a real thing. But in terms of ideology, I don't think that the North Korean Byungjin Line itself means that Guam is under more of a threat than it might otherwise be. And I believe that the Byungjin Line itself and Kim Jong-un's entire ideology, and indeed his entire persona, to the extent that he physically embodies the king's two bodies, if you read Honek Kwon, the anthropologist here at Cambridge, in his work, this kind of idea of the eternal, monarch, he's very much in line with his grandfather. We want to talk about unification, but we don't have to do it, because Grandpa tried that, and it was awfully bloody, and it didn't go very well, and we had to change our ideas back in the 1970s. 1972, very unpopular year to discuss, right? Not very sexy, not very exciting, limited détente, modification of goals by the North Korean state on the Korean Peninsula, changed model for unification. What does that mean for us now? What is all this nonsense happening with the Olympic Games, North Korean pop stars going to the south? Is this psyops? Right? They don't play games with Twitter feeds, right? They might send a few nasty attachments, a little malware here and there, a bit of hacking the NHS computers, right? They recently brushed back at that. They said, we didn't hack the NHS, it was the Americans. Right? So they're capable of all these things that Louise has mentioned in great detail, and continues to mention, I hope, I'm sure. We'll hear more. But the idea being that the North Koreans are capable of doing this kind of, how do we say, asymmetrical warfare, or messing with the internal interference. Sorry? The Sony hack, as you probably... Yeah, the Sony hack, it's there, right? So there's evidence, there are breadcrumbs, or technological crumbs. For those of you who like to smash computers like my father did, working class Americans smashing computers in the 1980s, taking the chips out, right? Follow the little lines there. There are to internal interference, but it's nothing compared to what Russia's doing. Number 4. Sorry, I've got numbers. I apologize. That's my only joke. I'm on number 4 of my outline. Equivalencies. This is a wonderful thing. We love to talk about North Korea, and another cheap and easy thing to say is they've learned the lessons of the Libyans. They've learned the lessons of Iraq. Kim Jong-un does not want to end up, as Ambassador Everard said, in service of a different point at dinner at the edge of a lamppost. Right? This is Romania. But let's talk not about the end of the Cold War, which is the salient comparison. Let's talk about Libya and Iraq. North Korea has nuclear weapons because they saw what happened in the mid-2000s. The North Korean nuclear program predates the fall of Iraq, the axis of evil, George W. Bush and his great moments of genius, right? It predates all of that, right? The Clinton administration had a problem with all of that. RT loves to push this kind of stuff, right? This kind of, read Fourth Media. Beijing is part of this. They've got a few people who come back and forth between Beijing and North Korea and write editorials about, what about Iraq? Great, let's talk about Iraq. Yeah, but we don't need to mix it all up with what North Korea is going to do or not going to do. They've got long, long archives. They've got a lot to discuss about the way in which they respond to us, the United Kingdom, and the way that they operate. Bloody nose. I don't think we should support a bloody nose strike on the North Koreans. It's a very attractive option, but the Chinese know where the weapons are, right? Caves, underground activities, right? Deep subways. The Chinese, if you go back to the Korean War and read the archives, the Chinese helped to dig a lot of tunnels. There are tunnels not just for artillery, but for other weapons and other things that people can live underground. They did during the Korean War. There are tunnels very deep in North Korea. We don't know where they all are. So when the American Air Force tells me, we can do it, we'll take out most of the stuff. Don't believe that. Don't believe that for a minute. Talk to friends in Beijing. Read some Chinese archives. Have a look at the history of the Korean War. Look at how the North Korean people lived underground for 3 years because of the pressure put on them by the American Air Force. I want to conclude by talking about the UK interest. I think we should support the sanctions that are going on, the American pressure campaign. I think we have to give them time to work, and I think that's the key message that Theresa May and others should give to their American counterparts. It's time to give the sanctions time to work. There's a lot of pressure. 5 resolutions at the United Nations in the last year, right? North Korea has moved very quickly towards nuclear program, and the pressure has increased as a result. Yes?
I totally agree. I'd just like to reinforce that, but in fact, the United States went to great efforts to exclude Russia from all talks involved with the PDRK. And this continued for quite a while until just before Christmas, they were talking to China again, who had a new plan. And they said, what is your new plan? They said, well, we've got a new plan. And the US said, what's this we business? China. And they said, no, China and Russia. We have a new plan. And the Chinese and Russian plan, you can read it anywhere you like, has been slow down, stop the rhetoric, start talking to these people, look at what we can offer them, tell them what the red lines are. So Russia, again, is a key player in this, although it has been opposed up until very recently, tooth and nail by the United States, because the United States recognizes they're a serious country that has opportunities and ways of dealing with this alongside China, as well as with the United States.
Should I respond? Very quickly, I agree that China needs to be talked to in tandem with Russia. They have been teaming up quite a lot, and there's pressure on the United States.
It's now Russia and China telling America, this is what you're saying. But they've done it just recently before Christmas.
They've done it for some time, for some years, saying war is not the way, dispute is... Talk. You have to talk to them.
Yeah.
Freeze the military drills, which the UK is observing between the South Koreans and the Americans. Yeah. I must draw my speech to a close. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. Before we go to our set of closing speakers, I'd like to go around one more time to see if anybody would like to make any points. would anybody like to speak in proposition of the motion? Please put your hand up. If so, if not, then I'll move on. Yes, at the top. Is there any microphones upstairs or not? It looks like there is now. Great. Thank you.
So I think a lot has been made of the very direct threats that North Korea and Russia pose. But I think one thing that has not been considered is that even if North Korea doesn't pose a very specific threat through its nuclear weapons, just the mere possession of these nuclear weapons and the fact that it has not been dealt with by the US shows that, well, really any state, it encourages any state to say, oh, we can do whatever we want, we can violate human rights to any degree as long as we have nuclear weapons. And this is something that really can set precedent for Iran if it seeks to do this. Any state that wanted to harm its own people can be encouraged by the situation in North Korea. And second to that, recently the Japanese have attempted to rewrite their constitution in order to enable them to get more military power, to expand their military power. And this is something as a result of the situation in North Korea. And this has knock-on effects of saying, well, China looks at Japan and says, oh, they're expanding their military, we should expand ours. This just creates a lot of extra, security threats in Asia as a result of that. And so even though North Korea itself might not be such a direct threat, the impact of its actions on other countries' security should be viewed as a threat.
Thank you very much, Charlie, for that speech. We now, if anyone would like to make a point in opposition of the motion, we've got quite a few. No idea how I'm going to choose. Yes.
Who was it?
Yeah, the guy on the right at the end, thank you.
I believe Russia is the greater threat to the UK and to the rest of the world. I want to focus on the rest of the world because it hasn't been spoken about as much so far. The idea of a Chinese-Russian peace plan for North Korea doesn't seem attractive at all to me. Chinese and Russian diplomacy consists in supporting the abusive regimes and their abusive activities. China and Russia have been protecting Myanmar in the Security Council. China and Russia consistently bail out Venezuela, despite 1,000% inflation, no medicine supplies, no food supplies, and increasing political repression. China and Russia are a threat to the people of every regime they support. And in that sense, I think the people of the world should be very afraid of what Russia and China are doing, particularly in Ukraine, in the Kurdish region. The Russians, I was amused to read that the Russians had complained in the UN Security Council about the Turks invading Kurdish regions because I'd heard the day before that they'd removed all their troops from that region in preparation for the Turkish strike. They're part of these international organizations, as Tim Riley said, but they use them for their own ends. They don't use them in the same way as we do, and they use them to protect themselves and other regimes like them and to increase their sinister influence around the world.
Thank you. Finally, would anybody like to speak in abstention? Yes, the man next to him. Please say your name.
Thank you, Henry Mitson, Gomberlin Keys College. I'm afraid I'm an ASNAC, so I've not got that much to say on sort of specific stuff, but I thought I'd just run through it. Personally, on both of these threats, I don't think we should fear either. I think both of them can be worked with. So the principal reason for this is I think in both cases, the policy direction is internal. The concern of both regimes is internal. So in the case of Putin, Putin's threatened by internal politics, and that's increasingly critical. I mean, we've seen Boris Nemtsov and the chant to fight against Putin within Russia. And I think most people would accept that Putin is only secure internally for as long as he can play, or Russia can play the role of the imperial or the superpower. So when we look at Crimea, the reason why Crimea is so important to the Russian people, the reason why it was the emotional center, the emotional heart of Russia, is because it contains the port of Odessa. It's the warm water port for Russia, and attached to that is Peter the Great's great navy. There's this huge imperial sort of center around Crimea, and the moment that was threatened by Western intervention or the idea of Western intervention, we don't have to do anything as the West to convince the Russian people that we're against them, because Putin can sell that narrative himself. The moment that the West appeared to be that threat, Putin moved in, and he can turn us into that threat. And so as long as he keeps the West off balance, has been pointed out by Tim Riley, and as long as he keeps the conflict alive, his position internally is more secure. So then when we look to North Korea, I think a similar thing can be seen, but the threat to North Korea is China's increasing involvement in capitalism, increasing cooperation with the West. And so I think Korea now is feeling threatened from that front. They no longer have that strong support. And this is something, again, we can work with. So, I mean, the nuclear project, the Korean nuclear project, is intended to put us off, to keep us off. They're trying to ensure their own security in the face of the fact that they're no longer secure with the help of China. And the same with killing relatives abroad. It shocks the West. It's another element of their keeping us off balance. Tim Riley said there was only one, but I don't think Tim Riley. Someone said there was only one element in use by North Korea. I think there are several elements in use here. And so North Korea, as I say, is desperate to secure their own position. So Korea is not, again, as Russia isn't, expansionist, as has been said. Neither are expansionist, and therefore we can work with those policies and draw those red lines, as has been mentioned. And so I think neither should be feared, but we should be able to work with these threats. So that's what I think.
Thank you very much to everyone who's spoken this evening, and thank you for that speech. If you have spoken, asked a question, point information, given a floor speech, please feel free to come along and grab a free drink afterwards in the dining room. So your cooperation and your involvement is hugely appreciated. So now if anyone wants to make any more points of information in the next two speeches to get a drink, I recommend it. You're welcome. So, next speaker, closing for the proposition, is John Everard, British diplomat and former ambassador to Belarus, Uruguay, and most recently, North Korea. John, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. Let me just pour myself a stiff vodka before I get going. It's good to be back. Thank you, yes. I was trying to remember sitting there when the last time was I sat in this chamber. It was decades ago, so many decades that even I can't count them. It's good to be back. It's also slightly sad because I remember when I was here in the late 70s, we used to have debates about whether we were going to be overrun by a militarist, expansionist Soviet Union. And I remember having debates with friends, sitting on the lawn of Emmanuel College, when Emmanuel still had a lawn, they hadn't built on it, trying to work out whether we were all going to die natural deaths or not. There was a kind of great gloom. We all stared into the abyss. The Russian tanks piled up on the borders of Western civilization. Then there were several decades where the whole threat seemed to go away, where we were on a roll. People talked about the end of history. And now here we are again, 2018, and we're talking not just about the threat from Russia, but the threat from North Korea. Not one threat, but two. And we're trying to work out which is worse. Let me start by saying that I think they're both pretty bad. I mean, I am going to try to convince you that the threat from North Korea is worse than that from Putin. That's not to say that I underestimate Putin. I think he is a threat to values we hold, to our freedoms, and to a safe and stable international order. But I think Kim Jong-un is even worse.
On that point.
Oh, we go. Okay. 5 words only, please.
You've talked about the international order, but
That's in 5 words. Thank you. Now, to pick up. Thank you, everybody. I want to try to take us to the conclusion I'm offering you. Thank you. We have the Putin Support Squad here. I want to try to take
was
you
up there.
to the conclusion I invite you to share through a logical sequence. I think there are 4 elements here. Firstly, what are these two people trying to do, Putin and Kim Jong-un? Secondly, how likely is it that they will do it? Thirdly, can they be stopped? Fourth, what is the effect? What does it matter to us, the House, you're saying, to us here, the UK, if they succeed? Other speakers have said far more eloquently than I can what Putin is about. Putin is about Putin. Self-aggrandizement, his ego, his wish to appear to be a great leader, a great Russian Tsar in the noble traditions. All his actions are bent in that direction, to look good in Syria, to throw the West, the arch-rival, off balance, to try to reinstate Russia as a great power, nibbling away at what used to be the Soviet Union, threatening Ukraine, threatening the Baltics, and so on. But Kim Jong-un's drive is quite different. Tim has already said, Kim Jong-un is trying to survive. He is trying to survive. This is a man with his back against the wall. This is a man who runs a regime so decrepit that he has had to execute his own uncle. He's had to have his own half-brother executed, assassinated, in the departure lounge of a foreign airport. He's in a bad way. He's got Donald Trump to reckon with. Okay, Donald Trump is something to reckon with for all of us, but if you are Little Rocket Man, you have got a problem. He's worried about his economy. The North Korean economy isn't often discussed. It's probably growing slightly. It is not growing anything like fast enough to keep modern generations of North Koreans happy. North Koreans are demanding more. They know that they're poor. They know that South Korea is massively richer than they are. And they want more of the action. Kim Jong-un has to satisfy that need, or he is in deep domestic political trouble. So what does he do? He starts to build nuclear weapons and the delivery systems to make them work. Why is he doing that? He's got 3 objectives. Firstly, to deter the United States and specifically Donald Trump. 5 words.
Get lost.
Thank you.
Okay. I've still got my other words. A point of information. Right.
Excuse
me. When did the North...
Tell me arbitration. We have 2 points of information.
When did the North Korean nuclear program begin? It didn't begin under Kim Jong-un. It didn't begin under Kim Jong-il. It probably began in the 1960s and maybe 72 or thereabouts. But this is not something that has just started now. It's been going on for an awful long time. And you know that as well as I know it.
Yes, I do know it. I know also that the reason for that program have changed over time. The reason that Kim Jong-un... No, that's the point I'm making. Kim Jong-un is pursuing this program for quite different reasons from his grandfather or his father. Louise.
Putin's sending Kim nuclear tech.
Yes.
That's why it's a bomb. 5 words.
An interventionist stuck to the word limit. Thank you, Louise. I appreciate that. He is, so is China, and there's probably other sources too. Yes, this is not all homegrown. You're quite right. It doesn't make it less dangerous, but I take your point. As I was saying, 3 objectives. 1, keeping Trump off his back. 2, he's probably looking in the end for some kind of negotiation. But to negotiate with the United States, he needs to be in a position of overwhelming power, and he believes he can get there by building the ability to destroy American cities. 3, at some point, North Korea has to deal with South Korea, a massively more successful, massively richer version of Korea on the other half of the peninsula. Unless somebody believes that South Korea is going to peacefully give away everything it's achieved in a negotiation with North Korea, that means force. And for that, eventually, North Korea is going to need nuclear weapons. Not in the immediate future, but somewhere down the line. That's part of the plan, I think. Okay, how likely is it that Putin on the one hand, Kim Jong-un on the other, are going to do what we fear they might do? It's important to recognize that Putin has a huge latitude of maneuver. He never declares in advance what he's going to do. He doesn't quite make it up day by day, but he can try things, draw back. If they don't work, he can try something else. Kim Jong-un is a great strategist. Putin isn't. He is an opportunist, and he's a tactician. He's got a lot more flexibility, and which means, on the other hand, that he can often be deterred. Kim Jong-un, on the other hand, I've said, this is all about survival. He is convinced he has to move ahead with his program of weapons of mass destruction. And unless he is prevented, that is exactly what he's going to do. A brief word about the current talks. Don't get excited. I don't think they're getting there. And I think it's quite clear that President Trump does not intend to change the view of North Korea just because North and South are talking. I'm out of time. I'm going to cut to the chase. The really big problem, the reason that Kim Jong-un is so much more dangerous than Putin, is the interaction that we now see going on between Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump. All right, only half of this is Kim Jong-un's fault. But this is where the danger comes. Because Donald Trump feels that Kim Jong-un is a threat, there's a real risk of nuclear war. How might a nuclear war break out? I don't think that a nuclear war is going to break out because of Russia. I think that Russia will continue to use soft power as far as it can, conventional forces where it has to, nuclear weapons, most unlikely. But I can see three scenarios where there is a real risk that a nuclear war breaks out because of North Korea. Number one, that North Korea tries to use nuclear weapons to force South Korea's hand, a problem which I alluded to just a minute ago. Problem two, Donald Trump. Donald Trump has said that he is not prepared to contemplate North Korea capable of destroying American cities. In Vancouver last month, General Mattis told assembled foreign ministers that the United States has a war plan, his phrase, and that if other methods to stop Kim Jong-un don't work, that he will be calling a meeting of defense ministers, presumably to implement it. This is not hypothetical, this is real, this is happening now. There is also the question of what North Korea would do if Donald Trump actually does attack North Korea. Sources fresh from the White House are telling me that the chances of his doing so is about 30%. North Korea, Tim's pointed out, has hollowed out its conventional forces. The only way it can respond now to an American attack is by the use of nuclear weapons. If North Korea starts to use them, of course, there will be American nuclear retaliation, and we are all, as they say, off to the races. Finally, third scenario, a mistake. Picture the scene. Donald Trump, propped on his pillows early in the morning, has a bad day of Fox News. In a rush of blood to the head, he tweets, "Little rocket man, we're coming for you." Moments later, somebody bursts into Kim Jong-un's office and says, "Respected martial leader, this is to come in, what do we do?" And in a matter of seconds, Kim Jong-un has to decide, is he going to risk that this is just another Trump tweet, or is he going to protect himself, his family, his country, his dynasty, and use the only weapons at his disposal to stop Trump, his nuclear weapons? Which would you do? Thank you.
John, thank you very much. Finally, to close the debate, and the final speaker for opposition is Alistair Donovan. Alistair is a finalist historian at Peterhouse and is one of the union's two current debating officers. He's represented the union at the most recent World and European Debating Championships, where he was one half of the fifth and the third best teams in the competition. Alistair, you have 10 minutes to finish. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. President. So throughout this debate, we've been consistently told that Kim Jong-un's only real card is the fact he either has nuclear weapons or is going to get nuclear weapons. I would imagine that what this means is that he's likely to avoid any situation which would ever force him to use them, because the act of using them is suicide for him. The only thing we can really say for sure about him is that he doesn't really like to risk his security, that he does want to survive, and that's kind of important in understanding his calculus. The reason he killed his family members wasn't really because he didn't like them, it's because they were the only people who could conceivably replace him and conceivably pose a threat to him within his own regime. Perhaps he is more evil than Putin. I don't really think that matters, because as long as he wants to live, in relative terms, that's not an issue. And wanting to gain a position of strength in future negotiations with the United States, wanting to eventually deal with South Korea, is not the same as risking his country and risking his own life. Even if he were to develop nuclear weapons and the capacity to use them, he's unlikely to ever use them or to actually create a credible threat of using them, because the only response that would come would be from the United States, and it would be his total and immediate destruction. We've been told by the last speaker the problem is that the US has a war plan. I have two responses to this. The first one is that literally every army should have a war plan for literally every situation. That's the point of armies, and if a general isn't doing that, they really should be fired. And the second, no thanks. And the second is that the US employing bellicose rhetoric to try and stop the North Koreans developing nuclear weapons doesn't actually mean they're going to follow through on any of it. Like, if you want to stop someone from doing something, you probably create that rhetoric anyway. It doesn't mean you're going to do something so monumentally stupid as risking Seoul being nuked. Because at least from a political perspective, that probably looks quite bad and is somewhat counterintuitive. I'm going to do three things in this speech, I guess. I'm firstly going to just address the floor speech we heard from up there. Secondly, talk about threats to the way of life, because Louise brought that up and then it got forgotten, which I think was poor. And then I'll talk a little bit about conflict. And so for the floor speech, which was a different take on the debate, the notion that what we need to fear about North Korea is the knock-on effect it has on Southeast Asia. And the example of this is Japan changed its constitution. What I'm going to say very briefly is that it seems quite unlikely this was a response to North Korea. I would posit it's more likely it was a response to China and aggression over the Senkaku Islands, and we think, realistically, the impact of North Korea on this is very minimal, and there'd be no material impact on the way in which you get forms of militarization throughout the entirety of Southeast Asia, even if you remove North Korea completely from the situation, because the greater threat is and is always going to be China. So I think that point of information, or floor speech, was interesting, but probably not very impactful in terms of what we should be thinking about. To the second and probably more important issue, the threat to the way of life, the threat that is posed credibly by Russia at the moment. Because I think most of us probably accept conflict is in reality quite unlikely, as everyone stands to lose a huge amount, literally no one stands to gain by it. And so what we probably should talk about is, even if Russia is the greater threat in that circumstance, and I'll explain why later, we should look probably at what we know is happening and fear what is going to impact our lives. And a threat to Western way of life, a threat to self-determination for literally every country, is probably important. And so that's why it doesn't matter what we say this House is. It doesn't matter if we're the UK, it doesn't matter if we're the West, it doesn't matter if we are literally every country in the world. Because the disruption of a status quo based upon false information to create instability is a harm to everyone, everywhere, and is something we probably should fear. And I think, firstly, a perversion to democracy, there's no need, but thank you very much. A perversion to democracy is probably an issue. And if we have reached a point where the news we see in front of us in most outlets becomes completely untrustworthy, or where it is not trusted and credible sources are no longer trusted by the majority of people, that's probably bad. That's something we probably should fear. And the impact that it has upon political discourse and the way in which we make decisions is important. And yes, it probably is true that North Korea does have some advanced persistent threats. It probably has some degree of hacking, but they're by no means a threat in the same way that Russia is, for two very obvious reasons. Firstly, there's fewer of them, they've got no money. And secondly, they have to spend all their time trying to steal foreign currency from Singapore and Macau, and so don't really have time to try and rig elections. By contrast, Russia can. Secondly, Barbara claims that the real threat about North Korea is Trump, and this is sort of echoed later on the proposition side. And if the threat is Trump and other unstable leaders throughout the world, given that Russia is a pretty major contributing factor to their rise to power, it would sort of seem to imply that we probably should fear Russia and its influence throughout the world. And given we know that false information is happening at the moment and that it is impacting elections and everyone's life in this room, we probably should fear Russia significantly more than we choose to fear North Korea. Second issue, probably more fun one, if less likely, threat of global conflict and everyone dying. Rafi says gives three reasons why North Korea is the people we need to threat. The first one is they don't recognize South Korea. I'm going to point out they haven't recognized South Korea for quite a long period of time, and I don't see why that's going to change or why their actions are materially going to be affected by that. He secondly says they fire test rockets over neighboring countries. As we sort of already been told, many of them can't really get off the ground, and lots of them, well, I mean, the basic problem is they don't have the warheads to go on them, so I don't think that's that much of an issue. And the third one, which is then echoed throughout the rest of his bench, is that North Korea haven't had nukes before, and somehow this is a problem. Like, they have had one of the largest conventional arsenals in the world and the ability to level Seoul completely. It's unclear what the ability to do it with nuclear means as opposed to just high explosives really is going to change in their thought process and their willingness or not to use these weapons. So then ultimately, why are we told they're a threat? Apparently it's because Kim Jong-un is scared, and he's scared for his own position. But it's kind of odd to assume that that suddenly means he's suicidal. Ultimately, North Korea's leadership is probably quite rational. Now, that's not to say they're still mad, because they are, but they're quite rational from their own perspective, and they're unlikely to do anything which constitutes a threat to their ability to live in the world. And anything which does constitute a threat to the rest of the world would be monumentally stupid for them, as they would all die. And I'm going to suggest they probably don't want that. Now, Barbara, to be fair, implicitly responds to this, and she does refer to the level of poverty and desperation amongst the Russian people, the analogy of shoeless soldiers. And that's probably true of the general population. That's probably true of all the privates and non-commissioned officers in the North Korean army. But I don't think it's true of the leadership. I don't think it's true of the Kims. I don't think it's true of the generals and the top brass who are privately educated outside of the country, and not even in relative standards, in absolute standards, are extraordinarily wealthy and enjoy a degree of life we would probably all envy. They have quite a lot to lose, and they make the meaningful decisions on what their country is going to do, because it is an autocratic state, and the ability of the people to influence decisions is ultimately quite limited. And to that extent, it seems quite unlikely they do something as monumentally stupid as kill themselves through an action they know will provoke a response. And to the extent that North Korea does need to respond to things like US incursions, it's unclear why, firstly, they do this to the point of total destruction of themselves. It's more likely that they actually do things that are ultimately quite meaningless and the US is going to know not to respond to. But secondly, it's really unclear why the US military would do anything to provoke them to that point. And it's unclear why they would allow literally any president, even Trump, to provoke North Korea that far, because they stand to gain absolutely nothing and potentially lose a huge number of US lives.
On that point.
Yeah, go ahead.
Same argument can be exactly extended to Russia.
So,
surely.
on to Russia and why that's not the case. So I'm going to say we should fear Russia at all levels, and I'm going to talk at the most extreme first and then get to the more realistic ones, because it's more fun that way. So firstly, nuclear war. Realistically, I agree with the last speaker. It's unlikely nuclear war is going to be started through a unilateral strike. It's much more likely to come through other situations. Probably conceivable one is a catastrophic mistake. He suggests the situation of Kim Jong-un massively misunderstanding a tweet from Donald Trump, because the logical response is that someone's going to declare war on you over tweets, which I think even anyone would guess that Trump wouldn't be stupid enough to do. But like, if we're talking about mistakes, North Korea has much fewer nuclear missiles than Russia, and the mistake kind of has to come from the people who are launching them. And given the dilapidated state of the Russian military and the fact there have been disasters in the past, not just presently in the past 20 years, but during the Cold War, would suggest they're probably a bigger threat in terms of mistakes. But secondly,
it only takes one nuclear missile to take out a city.
Yeah, I know that, which is why I'm saying if you have more of them, the probability of a mistake happening is higher, and therefore you'd fear the people with more nukes more. I think mathematically that makes some sense. Second one is just on conflict growing out of control, and I think this is one where it is important to consider what Russia actually is doing. Because soldiers can go a bit too far on the ground. They can force a reaction from an opposing side, and you can get a sense of military creep taking place over years. And sometimes it can go through too far. And even if your army is poorly equipped, at the worst, that means all-out war. But even at the best, it means lives being lost. And that's a threat that faces all of us, and is something that we should fear. We're told it's not a problem for Russia because Putin is very good at escalation, and so far he's been predictable. That doesn't necessarily mean he's going to be like that in the future, because of what the incentives he has are. War and conflict are unpredictable. They go out of hand, and you cannot control exactly what your soldiers are going to do. And because of that, it doesn't matter how tactical an individual leader you are, you cannot guarantee security over the long term, and conflicts can escalate. It won't necessarily remain the case that he's always going to be predictable. He's had so much success on incursions in the past, arrogance can make him go too far in the future. All of that is a problem. Worst case, all-out nuclear war. More likely, greater conflict, more death. All of those are bad things. Even if Russia is not currently pressing for massive expansion, it is so many soldiers deployed on so many fronts in a military structure that is quite frankly appalling. It is likely that you get problems if they're there for long enough. And even if it is the case that Putin only pursues conflicts to placate Russian nationalists, given they are a conceivable challenge to him and will remain a conceivable challenge to his regime, this is something that is going to happen over and over again. It is a constant domestic pressure to act belligerently. It's not going to go away, and it means you get more conflicts and more chance for death. What does this all mean? Russia has the greater capacity to start a conflict because there are much more occasions where it can, and there are credible scenarios where it is going to start putting soldiers on the ground, and you can get a situation where escalation occurs. The type of conflict can get significantly worse, as Russia can go further before it thinks it has too much to lose, and it can go beyond the point of no return. North Korea is not suicidal. Russia could more likely accidentally do this, and in terms of scale, the threat of Russia is significantly greater. Seems like we should fear it more.
Thank you very much, Alistair, for closing this debate. Just before I tell you all about voting, just tomorrow we have Roger Stone coming at 7 p.m., which will be fantastic. And then our next week debate is on Brexit, featuring Jacob Rees-Mogg, Helena Morrissey, Nicky Morgan, and also now we can announce also featuring Lord Adonis, which should be very interesting. So to vote in this debate, if you were the proposition, please go through the door marked Ayes on the right, with the opposition through the door on the left. If you're abstaining, walk through the middle. Thank you very much.